was about 2003, and it was the first time that I met the first lead pastor that I would work with, a man by the name of Daryl Swafford. And the first time that we set up a meeting, we had set up to meet at his house. We arranged to meet at his house right around 2 o'clock. I mean, that was the phrasing, around 2 o'clock. So I did my stuff that I was trying to get done, and I got over to his house, and it was a little bit after 2. I'm talking like within like 5 minutes or so. And I went up to the door, knocked on the door. He opened the door. The first words out of this man's mouth, this is the first time that we have ever spoken face to face, was, "You're late." And I knew that, okay, that's a red flag. Daryl went on, I began to see that Daryl went on to feel like that he could run over anybody. As I got to know him during that conversation, he told me that he was retired Navy, that he had been a Master Chief of a nuclear submarine in the 80s and 90s. He spent months, 6 months to a year at sea, chasing in these war game scenarios with other Russian subs and during the Cold War. And he felt like that he could operate the church like he was still a Master Chief. And I'll never forget one interaction that we had. It was during the summer, and church camps were going on. And I wasn't involved in the church camps at that time. It was basically my first full year at this church. But he asked me to go visit the camps when our kids were there, and that's fine. I did that. For some reason, during this one particular week, he wanted me to go hang out at night at these camps, at this particular camp. And I worked in Macon. We lived in a town just south of Macon called Moberly, and my wife worked in a town just south of Moberly called Columbia. And we had an infant girl at the time. Jenna was a baby then. And so Grandma would watch baby Jenna, and then while we were at work, and Tori would swing by and pick her up, and we'd be at home. And I didn't want to be gone at night. And there was one particular night that Tori, my wife, she needed me to be home and be a husband and father to our infant, right? And to help. So I didn't go to camp. The next day, you would have thought that I had murdered somebody, because he called me into his office and just ripped me a new one, told me stories about how I knew, like I just mentioned a second ago, how he had been gone. He would be gone for months and months and months at sea. And then when he would get home, his little ones wouldn't recognize him. As he told me this as he chuckled, and then was inferring that the house stuff, the raising the kid, that's what Tori's for. And I'm supposed to be off earning whatever. It was one of the longest periods of my life when it came to working within the church. He lasted about 2 years there, and I was never more happy than I was the moment that he came in to tell me that he was resigning. And we have all known leaders like this: narcissistic, abusive, corrosive. And then you add in the aspect of being a spiritual leader, and you have the makings of some very real and horrible abuse and trauma. And some of you watching this may be victims of systems or leaders that allowed this to happen. And it happens over and over and over again. We set up these structures, right? And we create these narcissistic leaders. And then we act surprised when they act like narcissistic leaders, right? It's almost daily that news comes out about another church leader abusing somebody within the church. And I don't even want to get into the statistics about abuse within the church. It's overwhelming. And let's just say this, let's just put it like this, that anytime you hear politicians or leaders screaming about things like grooming that's taking place in the classroom by teachers, or taking place at things like drag shows, or whatever else they're trying to attack at the moment, understand it's not happening in those places. It's happening within the church. And the overwhelming majority of those doing the abusing are white male pastors and youth pastors. The call is coming from inside the house. So how do we, right, as a faith community, how do we shift resist leaders like this? How do we create structures that protect the entire faith community and not abuse? I want to welcome you guys to Shift Online. My name is Joe Smith, I'm the lead pastor here, and if you are watching this at the time that it was premiered on YouTube at 10:30 a.m. Eastern on New Year's Day, then bravo, you're the real MVP. I'm just kidding. We are thankful and humbled that you would take any part of your day, whenever you were watching this, wherever you were watching from, to be with us. Today we're kicking off a new series in the new year called A Church Called Tov. Now, the word Tov is a Hebrew word that means good. We see that word for the very first time in the creation poem in Genesis chapter 1, the very first book of the Bible, first chapter, when God looks at all that's been created and calls it good. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, that word Tov, or good, is found almost 600 times, and it is a master theme of all of Scripture. This series, the organization called Shift, and the class that we use for newcomers called Second Shift, are all based on this book called A Church Called Tov, Creating a Goodness Culture. It's written by Scott McKnight and his daughter, Laura Barringer. Now, it was written in response to something that Laura and her family experienced at one of our country, America's very first mega churches, and a mega church celebrity pastor. When their pastor that they had, and you can read the book, was shown to be something other than what the church said that he was, it was devastating for them, for her family, and for thousands of other people. And many of you watching this know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you have experienced this personally, that the church, right, the entity itself, the organization, creates this brand, this cult of personality, builds everything around this central figure, and creating like this rock star, basically, right? And then when that pastor begins acting like a rock star, everything starts falling apart, and it happens so much that it just kind of feels like it's wash, rinse, and repeat. Well, when we restarted Shift, we decided to be a part of creating something different, something that isn't just a part of the cycle that's always been. We wanted to be in a church. We wanted to be part of a church that valued this goodness culture above all else. And that starts by putting people first. Now, many of you know our story, our personal story, my family story. We've been in the local church for 22 years. I have spent my entire adult life working within the local church. And we've done a little bit of everything. We've been part of kids ministries, all the way up to lead ministry, and anything that's found in between that. And over all those years, we personally experienced just how taxing it can be to be a part of the church. Jesus talks about this. In Matthew's account of Jesus' life, Jesus talks about this kind of ministry philosophy. It's in chapter 23, and it's verses 1 through 5. It says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example. For they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show.'" And I'm not a gambling man, but I'm willing to bet that if you've ever been in church for any period of time, then you've probably volunteered. And if you have volunteered, I'm also willing to bet that at some point in time, that became overwhelming. I personally know people that have given upwards of 20 hours a week volunteering, unpaid, to a local church. Every time you see a mega church pastor or leader on some sort of large platform, and I don't actually mean the real platform, I mean like the platform that's been built for them as a leader. That platform has been built on the backs of hundreds, if not thousands, of unpaid volunteers. So what are we going to do to combat this, right? How do we resist a culture that creates abusive leaders and systems? We do that. We're going to do that by nurturing a culture of grace and empathy. Now, I need you to stick with me because I understand that probably sounds really churchy, but hear me out. Leaders shaped by goodness are grace dispensers, okay? They are agents used and called by God to help, to be with, to offer grace to the people that they serve. One of our leaders on the leadership team is a man named George. He's going to kill me when he hears this. He didn't know I was going to do this. But George is an agent of grace. Like, he is a grace dispenser. George and I have had a mutual friend by the name of Larry who passed away recently. And George gave so much grace to Larry. He was the one that would show up on Larry's doorstep if Larry needed anything, even before he was sick, taking him out to lunch and just making sure he was okay. He was an older gentleman, lived alone. But when he got sick, George was there. George was the one that took him to almost all of his doctor's appointments, to almost all of his tests, his treatments. When Larry was finally in hospice, towards the end of his life, every time I was there, George was there. I saw George talking with them, joking with them, when Larry was responsive. But even more importantly, when Larry stopped being responsive and we weren't sure if he was aware of what was going on, George was still there, still talking to him, and still joking with him like they always had, telling him what was going on, poking fun, all of this stuff. I saw George lift Larry's head and help him drink when Larry was too weak to do so himself. George was there in the last hours of Larry's life. That's what grace looks like. So how can a leader insult people, right? Reprimand staff members, take advantage of those that they're supposed to serve after offering the grace of Jesus to them, like we see George doing to Larry? It's illogical. It can't happen. Now, any church that transforms into like a power-based, fear-based, exploitative culture, they have nothing to do with grace. They are providing like the bones of death rather than the grace of life. So what we're going to do is that we're going to learn and continue to establish and maintain a culture of grace that is life-giving in order to combat and push back against a toxic culture that we see so prevalent in the church today, just like George and Larry. In Jesus' first sermon in his home synagogue, he's called up to do the reading, and he opens up the scroll, and in the scroll it's Isaiah. It's the Old Testament book of Isaiah, and Jesus reads from a particular passage in Isaiah. It's found in chapter 61, verses 1 through 3, and this is what Jesus read aloud. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come." Now, Jesus and that particular passage, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. I mean, this moment right here is a tov or goodness moment, okay? The mission and message of Jesus for his people completely matched Isaiah's idea, Isaiah's prophecy of what God would do to reassure the fortunes of his people. Jesus arrived to proclaim freedom and liberation to the imprisoned, to bring good news or tov to the poor and impoverished. He would grant freedom, right? He would bring this liberation, this freedom to the downtrodden and sight to the blind. Hear me when I say this. It's the injured, the mistreated, the disregarded, the abused, the misplaced, and those violated. They are at the center of Jesus's message. Because Jesus has the eyes of God, he sees them. And Jesus can be summed up with one word: empathy. Okay? Empathy is the capacity to leave one's own experience behind and enter into somebody else's experience. Understanding the world through somebody else's suffering is empathy. And we are going to cultivate that culture of empathy to push back against these toxic cultures. This year, one of the biggest lessons that I have taken away from 2022 is empathy. Many of you know that if you're part of the Shift community, whether locally or online, you know that this past July, our friends at the Pride Center suffered a hate crime. And I was driving back from Publix that morning. I don't remember what I was getting, but I got a text message from one of my friends over there and saying that the center had been vandalized. And I just knew in my heart, I got to go over there. So grabbed my son, grabbed some supplies. We headed over for the cleanup. And I got there, and I've talked about this before, but just the devastation, the windows that were smashed, these large stones that were like, they weren't thrown, they were hurled through these plate glass windows and embedded into the wall, and all of the devastation from that, the hate note that was left behind. To see that, to see the world, I had never experienced that. I'll be honest. I have never experienced anything like that. And then to come out of myself and to see the world through the eyes of people that I love and care deeply for, it broke me. Listen, this is something that I have to own, that I have to deal with on my own. I can go literally almost anywhere unafraid. I do not have to worry about walking down the street and somebody yelling something at me or somebody calling the police on me. I just don't have to worry about it. I don't worry about mouthing off to authorities. All right, I shouldn't, but I don't have to worry about it, right? I can go into almost any room, all right, and feel like I own this space. You know, as a white male, as a white Christian straight male in the United States, I can go into any space, and it might even be your space, but I can go into any space. When I get there, my default position, like for better or for worse, my default position that has been like put into me is that this is now my space. This is now my room, and that is my privilege, and I have to own up to that. But to drive up to our local Pride Center, to see all the damage that was done, to look in the eyes of people that I care about, and to then experience what they were experiencing, that somebody hated them enough to come up there and do that just because of who they are. To see the anger and the hurt and the desperation and the fear and the fury in their eyes. The mark of empathy is to feel someone else's pain. The mark of compassion is to feel that pain and then do something about it. Shift, hear me when I say this, that God created the church to be a Tov culture, rich in grace and empathy and compassion. God created the church to embrace the underprivileged, the persecuted, and those in need, not the powerful and the privileged. Okay? Understand that. Those in need. And like Jesus, for those of us that are in positions of privilege, we need to seek to ease suffering, not because they need to be rescued, but because it's our mission. If we are followers of Jesus, then we are to emulate the life of Jesus, and he lived this way. And so this is our starting point for this new year. There is no conclusion to this sermon because this is where we begin. So we will embrace grace and empathy so that, like Jesus, we can stand with and beside those that others push aside and try to ignore. We're going to be with those that our current culture and our current power structure seek to marginalize, and we will see people with the eyes of Jesus because it's what we're called to do. It's why we're here. Now, as the pastor of Shift, I feel like I need to make a promise to you. So here it is. And I want you to hold me to this. This isn't lip service. I need you to hold me to this. If we ever become anything other than a church of Tov, a church with a goodness culture, I promise you, write it down, mark it, tattoo it, I don't care. I promise you that I will resign, or I will fight to remove the leaders that are taking us in the direction of a toxic culture. Now, as a community, I need you to make a promise as well, okay? I need you to make a promise. Write it down, take a picture of it, tattoo it, whatever. I need you to make this promise. If Shift ever becomes anything other than a church of Tov, I need you to promise me that you will demand my resignation or the resignation of those that are responsible. And I need you to promise too that if none of those measures work, if for some reason we go off the deep end and our entire leadership team becomes like this toxic, abusive, narcissistic group of people, then what I need you to do is I need you to leave Shift, and I need you to do so very loudly. I need you to be loud about it. Do not leave quietly and allow abusive leaders to continue to abuse people. I need you to make that promise, okay? I make that promise to you. Hold me accountable to that, and I need you to make that promise to us, and we'll hold you accountable to that as well. Now, if you're watching this and you're not a part of Shift, all right, and you happen to find, you listening to this, you begin to realize, or maybe you already know, that you are in a toxic church culture, I'm going to ask you to leave that place immediately. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Just get out. You don't need to go explain yourself to anybody, because hear me as I say this, like literally as a pastor, standing on stages like this, talking to people like you do not need an organization to have a relationship with God. You do not need it, okay? Hear me when I say this. So many of us have left the evangelical system of church in the United States. And we were blessed enough to find each other here at Shift. But so many of us have left this current system simply because we were trying to find Jesus. As a church and people of Tov, we will be marked by grace and empathy. And as an organization, we will put people first, even at the expense of the organization. And so as we begin to wrap this up, right, for our reflection time, like I said, there's really no conclusion to this. This is our starting point. This is day one of a new year. This is where we're starting. So for our reflection time, I think that we should all, like in this symbolic moment of newness, right, that we should all take stock in ourselves, look back at the past year, and dream about the year to come. And see, where are we living this out? Where are we living out grace and empathy well, and where are we not living it out well? How are we treating those that we disagree with? How are we treating those that we're closest with? So Shift, I think the last question that we need to ask is, what do we need to do now, right, in this moment, to create a goodness culture, to maintain a goodness culture, to nurture that culture of Tov here at Shift? But more importantly, how do we do that at home? I think those are the questions that we need to wrestle with, that we need to ask continually through this upcoming year. I want to thank you guys for joining us on Shift Online. We will be back in person next week. Can't wait to hang out. Now, get out of here and go love on some people.